Have you ever just stopped and really thought about yourself, like what it means to be you, experiencing the world and all? It's a question that's been around forever, right? Like from the very start of philosophy, people have been trying to figure out this whole consciousness thing.
It's true. This whole idea of understanding awareness, like what it means to be conscious, that's a huge question that's been driving us for centuries. And in a way, when we dive into these questions about how we experience the world, well, we're kind of acting as philosophers ourselves, aren't we?
Totally. We're all philosophers in our own way. And today, we're going to tackle this consciousness thing head on. But not just by, thinking about it in the abstract. We're going to bring in some serious science, look at what neuroscience is discovering about the connection between our physical brains and those incredible subjective experiences we all have.
Right on. And you've gathered some amazing resources for this, especially that super detailed entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on the neuroscience of consciousness. It's basically like a constantly updated encyclopedia of everything we know about trying to connect the tangible physical stuff in our brains to our totally intangible inner worlds.
And that's what we're aiming to do for you today. Pull out the most important insights from all this cutting-edge research and theories. We're going to explore how neuroscience even tries to define and track something as slippery as consciousness, unpack all the different theories about what actually makes a mental state conscious, and even get into how scientists are messing with the brain in a good way, of course, to try and nail down the neural basis of specific conscious experiences. Consider this your cheat sheet for wrapping your head around some seriously complex stuff without getting totally lost. So how do we even begin to make sense of all this?
Well, I think the biggest hurdle right off the bat is that consciousness is, well, so personal and subjective, right? It's like, how can a hard science like neuroscience really capture those individual internal experiences that are so unique to each of us?
Yeah, it's a real head scratcher. I mean, science is all about observation and measurement, but how do you objectively measure someone's joy or the way they experience the color blue?
Exactly. We can't just peek into someone else's consciousness directly. So neuroscience has to rely a lot on what we can observe, like their behavior. One of the most direct ways we can get a glimpse into that inner world is through introspective reports, basically just people telling us what they're experiencing.
So it comes down to me describing what's going on in my own head, which, how reliable is that really? Can I always accurately put those feelings and perceptions into words?
You hit the nail on the head. It's a big question, and it's something scientists are always debating. There are definitely concerns about introspection. Like, we all have biases, and sometimes words just don't do our experiences justice. So neuroscience is actively looking for ways to figure out just how accurate introspection really is, to understand when our self-reports are more or less reliable.
And how do they even go about doing that? It feels like trying to, I don't know, measure the wind with a feather or something.
That's a pretty good analogy. One way they're trying to get a handle on this is by using something called signal detection theory, or SDT. Imagine you're in a really noisy cafe, and there's this faint song playing in the background. SDT basically helps us understand how well we can pick out that signal, the song amidst all the noise. And it takes into account both how clear the signal is and how likely we are to say, yeah, I hear it, even if it's super subtle. So with introspection, the signal is the conscious experience itself, and our report is shaped by how strong that experience is and how willing we are to report even subtle things. And this isn't just for faint melodies. It's a key way psychologists figure out how we make any kind of decision where things are uncertain.
Gotcha. So a really clear, strong experience is like a loud song, easy to pick out. And my willingness to report even a tiny feeling is like adjusting how sure I have to be before I say I heard the music.
Exactly. And just like with that music, there's always a chance you might miss an experience you actually had or have a false alarm and report something that wasn't really there. By using SDT as a model for introspection, scientists can start to account for those potential hiccups. But here's the thing, they're also getting creative and finding ways to study consciousness without even asking people to describe their experiences directly.
Wait, really? How do you study consciousness without asking someone what they're experiencing? It seems like you need that, right?
It's pretty cool. They're using something called no-report paradigms. The idea is to track consciousness through things our bodies do automatically without us having to explain what we're experiencing. Like, a perfect example is using binocular rivalry experiments with eye tracking.
Hmm.
You remember, with binocular rivalry, you see different images in each eye, and your perception switches back and forth between them.
Right, like 1 second I might be aware of seeing, say, a picture of a mountain, and then suddenly it switches to a picture of a face, even though both pictures are still right there in front of me.
Exactly. So researchers have gotten super clever and added tiny little fixation points at different spots within each image. They train people, even animals sometimes, to just look at the fixation point wherever it pops up without saying anything about what they're seeing. And then, by tracking their eye movements really precisely, researchers can guess which image they're probably experiencing. If their eyes move to where a fixation point on the mountain image was, even if they don't say mountain, it suggests that's what they're seeing at that moment.
So their eyes basically become this silent way of telling us what they're experiencing without needing words. That's pretty ingenious.
It is. These no-report paradigms are a really clever way to study consciousness in folks who can't communicate their experiences, or even in animals. But of course, there's a catch. These indirect measures usually need to be checked against those good old subjective reports in people who can talk about their experiences. And it's super important to make sure that whatever behavior you're tracking is really tied to consciousness and not some other unconscious process.
Makes sense. You got to make sure that whatever you're using as a stand-in for a verbal report is actually a good indicator of what's happening consciously. Are there any other ways they're tackling this whole subjective experience thing?
Well, another interesting approach is to look at metacognition, specifically how confident people are when they make judgments about what they're perceiving. The idea is that being consciously aware of something might make you more confident in your judgment about it.
So, like, if I say, okay, that pattern was definitely tilted to the left, you'd ask me, how sure are you about that?
Exactly. If you were really consciously aware of that tilt, you'd probably be pretty confident in your answer, right?
Yeah.
Researchers can then analyze the relationship between those confidence ratings and how accurate people actually are. It's an indirect way to peek into their conscious awareness.
That's interesting. It's like asking me to rate how strong my internal signal was without actually describing what I saw. But you're still relying on me to tell you how confident I am, right?
You are. It's a more quantifiable measure, but it doesn't completely ditch introspection altogether. However, it lets you compare different types of experiences and brings a new level of analysis to studying awareness. So we've talked about some methods, but how does neuroscience actually define consciousness in a way that lets them study it scientifically?
Yeah, that's a big one. We all kind of know what consciousness is, right? But defining it precisely, well, that's a lot harder than it seems.
You're right, it's a tricky one. Neuroscience often makes a distinction between generic consciousness, which is all about whether a mental state is conscious or not, and specific consciousness, which is about the actual content of that conscious state, like what you're feeling or perceiving.
Yeah.
These are the two big questions that drive a lot of the research in this field.
So it's not just about figuring out if someone is like awake and aware of their surroundings, but also about understanding what they're specifically conscious of at any given moment.
Exactly. And this is where we bump into what philosopher David Chalmers called the hard problem of consciousness. And it's a really deep question. How do those physical processes in our brain create the feeling of what it's like to be us, to have these rich, subjective inner lives? It's pretty mind-boggling when you really think about it.
It really is. How does all that stuff happening in our brains turn into this inner movie that we're all experiencing?
Right. And while the hard problem is still this huge philosophical challenge, a lot of neuroscientists are focusing on what Chalmers called the easier problems. And these aren't necessarily easy, but they are more open to scientific investigation. They're all about figuring out the neural basis of generic consciousness, like what flips the switch from unconscious to conscious, and specific consciousness, like what determines the actual content of our awareness.
And that leads us to this idea of neural correlates of consciousness, or NCCs, right? I've heard that term thrown around.
You got it. The hunt for NCCs has been a major focus in the neuroscience of consciousness. At first, it was all about finding brain activity that just happened to occur alongside conscious experience. But now, researchers are looking for something more explanatory correlates. Neural activity that isn't just associated with consciousness, but might actually be enough to cause it.
So instead of just noticing, oh, this part of the brain lights up when someone says they're experiencing something, you're looking for the neural activity that, if you could somehow trigger it, would actually create that specific experience.
That's the goal. But here's the challenge you have to show that this neural activity is both necessary, like you absolutely need it for the experience to happen, and sufficient, like it's enough on its own to make the experience pop into existence. And that's really tough because our brains are so adaptable and redundant. It's not usually as simple as finding one specific part that makes the whole thing work.
It's like trying to pick out one instrument in a giant orchestra and saying, this one right here, that's the one that makes the entire symphony.
Exactly. It's usually a much more complex, distributed process. So neuroscientists are coming up with different theories that try to explain these broader neural mechanisms that might be behind consciousness. I want to dive into some of those major theories.
Absolutely. Let's hear what they've come up with.
Okay, so first up, we've got the global neuronal workspace theory, or GNW for short. The basic idea here is that a thought or feeling becomes conscious when it gets broadcast across the entire brain, kind of like sharing it on a brain-wide internet. Only those thoughts that go viral, so to speak, reach consciousness.
So it's like different departments in a company sharing info at a big meeting, making it accessible to everyone.
Exactly. According to GNW, for something to become conscious, the neural activity representing that information needs to be strong and long-lasting enough to get access to this global workspace and be broadcast to all those different cognitive systems in our brain. And this happens through widespread activation in the cortex and those feedback loops we talked about earlier.
So a bit of information can't just hang out in one tiny corner of the brain. It needs to reach a certain level of importance and be shared widely to enter our conscious awareness.
Exactly. GNW is a pretty popular theory, and people who support it often point to brain imaging studies that show a lot of widespread neural activity when people say they're consciously aware of something. But there's this debate about whether GNW really explains phenomenal consciousness, that subjective feeling of what it's like to experience something, or just access consciousness, which is more about being able to use and report on that information. And because we often use people's reports to study phenomenal consciousness, it can be really hard to tease the two apart.
It's that tricky distinction again, right? The very act of me describing my experience might be what causes that widespread brain activity, not the actual feeling itself. So what's another theory that tackles this from a different angle?
Well, there's the recurrent processing theory, or RPT. This theory suggests that consciousness actually arises from feedback processing that happens within sensory areas themselves, without needing to broadcast that information globally across the brain. So instead of needing a central hub, this theory says consciousness can emerge locally, like seeing something really clearly without necessarily being able to name it.
So it's like consciousness can bubble up in the areas of the brain responsible for processing our senses without needing to go through a central clearinghouse.
That's the gist of it. Think about vision again. Information from your eyes goes through a bunch of different stages in the visual cortex. RPT highlights the importance of feedback connections within these visual areas. Basically, the idea is that this constant back and forth flow of information, the recurrent part, is what creates visual consciousness.
And what about that idea of overflow we talked about before? You know, the possibility of having conscious experiences that we can't necessarily describe. Where does RPT fit into that?
RPT is often seen as an overflow theory because it says that phenomenal consciousness can come from this local processing in sensory areas. It means you could have a conscious experience without that information ever reaching the global workspace to be reported or used for other cognitive tasks. It's like seeing something vivid and detailed, but not being able to explain what you're seeing.
So we've got local consciousness versus global consciousness. What's the next theory in the lineup?
Next up, we have the higher order theories, or HUT.
Whoa.
The main idea here is that something is only conscious if you have a higher order representation of it in your mind. It's not just seeing the color red, it's thinking, I am seeing red.
So it's the awareness of your own mental states that makes them conscious.
Exactly. And the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in all sorts of high-level thinking, is thought to be a key player in creating these higher-order representations. People who like HIT often point to studies that show increased activity in the frontal lobe when people are consciously perceiving something. But there are some problems with this view, too. Like, there are patients with damage to their prefrontal cortex who still seem to have conscious experiences, even though that thinking about thinking part should be impaired.
Right. If consciousness was totally dependent on that higher order thinking, then damage to those areas should basically wipe out conscious experience, and that's not always what happens. So we've covered global broadcasts, local sensory processing, and now thinking about our own thoughts. What's next?
Okay, now for something a little different, we've got the integrated information theory, or IIT. This one starts with phenomenology, which is basically the study of the nature of experience itself rather than starting with the brain. IIT says that consciousness is integrated information, and they measure this using something called phi, represented by the Greek letter O. Think of phi as a measure of how interconnected the different parts of a system are and how much they contribute to the whole experience. A hi-fi suggests a rich, unified, conscious experience where information is all woven together.
Integrated information, huh? That sounds pretty abstract. How do they connect that to our actual subjective experiences?
Well, they start by identifying what they call phenomenological axioms. These are like basic truths about conscious experience, like the fact that it exists, it has specific content, it feels like one unified thing, and so on. Then they try to connect these axioms to the physical world, suggesting that consciousness arises from physical systems that have these properties, specifically systems that integrate information in a special way. The amount and structure of this integrated information, that value, is supposed to determine both how conscious something is and the specific quality of that consciousness.
So, according to IIT, anything that integrates information to a certain degree could be conscious, even if it doesn't have a brain like ours.
That's one of the more controversial aspects of IIT. It suggests that even simple systems might have a little bit of consciousness, an idea called panpsychism. But IIT also gets a lot of criticism because it's really hard to test, and some of its ideas seem kind of out there. Like calculating I-type for something as complex as the human brain is incredibly difficult, and some of its predictions about what kinds of things might be conscious just don't match up with what we know about the brain or even our own intuitions.
Sounds like a really ambitious theory, trying to bridge the gap between subjective experience and the fundamental nature of reality, but maybe with some pretty big challenges in terms of actually proving it.
Exactly. And all these theories we've talked about, GNW, RPT, HI-T, and IIT, often end up in this sort of front versus back debate about which parts of the brain are really essential for consciousness.
Front versus back. It's like a territorial battle happening inside our skulls.
Yeah, kinda. RPT and some versions of IIT emphasize the back of the brain, especially those sensory processing areas, as being crucial for creating conscious experience. On the other hand, HOT is all about the prefrontal cortex at the front of the brain, and GNW, with its emphasis on widespread broadcasting, could be seen as bridging the two.
So, depending on which theory you prefer, you might think that seeing something is mainly happening in the back brain, while being aware that you're seeing it involves the front brain, and the whole experience of consciousness is a collaboration between the two.
That's a good summary. This front versus back distinction helps us see where different theories focus their attention and where researchers might look for evidence to support or challenge those theories.
This is giving me a much clearer picture of how neuroscientists are approaching this question of what makes something conscious. But can we dive into a specific example? What about unconscious vision? That's always seemed super intriguing to me.
Definitely. Unconscious vision, where people respond to visual stuff without actually being aware of seeing it, is a fascinating way to study consciousness. It lets us look at situations where visual processing is happening, but there's no subjective experience of sight.
Like blind sight, right? Where people with damage to their visual cortex can still avoid obstacles even though they say they can't see anything. It sounds almost impossible.
It does seem paradoxical, but blind sight and similar things like actions guided by the dorsal visual stream in patients with visual agnosia suggest that there might be a separation between visual processing that leads to conscious awareness and visual processing that guides our actions without us knowing about it.
And this brings in those two main visual pathways in the brain, right? The dorsal and ventral streams, the where-how, and the what pathways.
Precisely. The general thinking, especially after the work of Milner and Goodale, is that the dorsal stream, going up to the parietal lobe, is mostly about guiding our actions in space, and it often works unconsciously. The ventral stream, going towards the temporal lobe, is thought to be more important for conscious visual perception, for recognizing and reporting what we see.
And patient DF, the woman with visual agnosia, is a perfect example of this, isn't she? She couldn't consciously see the shapes of things, but she could still interact with them perfectly fine.
Exactly. DF's case was one of the first really strong pieces of evidence for this separation of function. She could do things like put a card into a slot, even though she couldn't actually see the slot. It showed that her dorsal stream was still working, even though that information wasn't reaching her conscious awareness.
So, our initial assumption that if someone acts intentionally based on what they see, they must be consciously seeing it, well, cases like DF throw a wrench in that, don't they?
They definitely make us rethink the connection between perception, action, and consciousness. If DF is doing something intentional based on visual information, why don't we say she's consciously seeing? Mainly because she keeps saying she can't see anything, and that goes against our intuition. So we have to think carefully about what kind of evidence we value most when we're trying to figure out if someone is having a conscious experience.
And what about blind sight? How does that fit into this whole conscious versus unconscious vision thing?
Blind sight, which usually happens when there's damage to the primary visual cortex, or V1, is another fascinating case. People with blind sight say they're blind in a certain part of their visual field, but they can often do things that require them to detect or discriminate visual stuff in that blind area, and they do way better than chance.
It's like they can sense things without actually seeing them. How is that even possible if their main visual processing center is damaged?
The thinking is that there might be other pathways that bypass V1, like pathways involving the superior colliculus and the thalamus. These alternate roads could be feeding information to those later visual areas, allowing for some unconscious processing to happen.
But there's also that other interpretation, right? The idea that maybe people with blind sight do have some faint conscious vision, but they're just super hesitant to report it, kind of like that conservative response bias we discussed earlier with signal detection theory.
That's right. There's this ongoing debate about whether blind sight is truly vision without consciousness or just a very weak form of consciousness that people don't feel confident reporting. And studies that use more detailed scales, asking people about the quality of your experience rather than just a yes or no, have produced all sorts of mixed results. It shows how important our methods are when we're trying to understand these phenomena.
It seems like unconscious vision really highlights how complex this whole consciousness thing is and how we have to be careful about those assumptions we make about perception, action, and awareness. Now let's shift gears a bit and explore how neuroscience tackles specific consciousness, that is, the neural basis of what we consciously experience.
Good transition. When we talk about specific consciousness, we're essentially asking what specific neural activity corresponds to the content of our experience, like seeing a specific shade of green or hearing a particular melody. And a lot of the research in this area is guided by something called neural representationalism, which is the idea that the content of our experience is directly linked to the content of neural representations in the brain.
So if I'm smelling coffee, there's a specific pattern of activity in my brain that somehow represents that particular smell.
That's the general idea. But as the source material mentions, defining what actually constitutes neural content is pretty tricky. Some models suggest it might be more probabilistic, meaning there's not always a perfect one-to-one match with our experience. However, for practical purposes, researchers often work with the assumption that there's a close link between brain activity and what we experience when they're trying to understand specific consciousness.
And one of the ways they study this is with the contrast strategy, often using binocular rivalry again, right?
Exactly. Binocular rivalry is super useful because the sensory input stays the same, but your conscious experience is changing. This lets researchers directly compare the brain activity when you're consciously seeing one image versus the other, helping them zero in on the activity that's specifically related to each percept.
So if you track my brain activity while my perception is flipping between, say, a cat and a dog in a binocular rivalry setup, you can start to see which neural patterns are associated with consciously seeing the cat versus consciously seeing the dog.
Exactly. And studies using fMRI and EEG have linked binocular rivalry to activity in a bunch of different visual areas, from early regions like V1 to later ones like the inferotemporal cortex and even the prefrontal cortex, suggesting that a whole network of brain regions is involved in this experience, not just one isolated area.
It makes sense that it wouldn't be just one lonely neuron or brain region responsible for the whole experience of seeing something. Are there other tools neuroscientists use to crack the code of specific conscious experiences?
Definitely. Another powerful tool is neural stimulation, where they directly manipulate brain activity and see how it affects perception. This can involve things like microstimulation, where tiny electrical currents are used to stimulate specific neurons, either in humans during brain surgery or in animal models.
So you're basically poking the brain with electricity and seeing what happens to someone's conscious experience. Sounds pretty direct.
It is a very direct approach, and some incredible experiments have used this technique. For example, researchers have used microstimulation to activate neurons in area MT, or V5, a part of the brain that processes motion, in monkeys. They found that by stimulating neurons tuned to a specific direction of motion, they could actually make the monkey more likely to report seeing motion in that direction, even when the actual visual stimulus was ambiguous.
Wow, so you could directly influence what the monkey consciously perceived by manipulating the activity of specific neurons related to motion. That's pretty compelling evidence for a direct link.
It is strong evidence. And this kind of approach aligns with the criteria that neuroscientists like Parker and Newsom have outlined for establishing a link between neural activity and perception, showing a correlation between the two and then demonstrating that manipulating the neural activity can actually change perception.
And it's not just limited to vision, right? They've done similar experiments with other senses too.
Absolutely. One really fascinating example is the work by Romo and his colleagues on touch. They showed that by stimulating the primary somatosensory cortex, or S1, in monkeys, they could actually make them feel like they were being touched, even when there was nothing physically touching them. And get this, the monkeys could even tell the difference between different frequencies of this artificial touch and compare it to real touch.
That's amazing. It's like creating a hallucination of touch just by stimulating the right neurons. And the fact that the monkeys acted the same way, whether the touch was real or created by stimulation, is really convincing.
It really starts to blur the line between what we think of as real sensory input and what our brains can generate internally. And as Romo himself pointed out, the next big step is to try and replicate these findings in humans so we can ask them about their experience and get those introspective reports.
It seems like we're getting closer and closer to understanding how those specific patterns of neural activity create the unique content of our conscious experiences.
We're definitely making progress. These studies, looking at different senses and using all sorts of techniques like binocular rivalry and neural stimulation, are giving us incredible insights into how our brains create what we perceive. And while we might not be able to fully read minds or create artificial consciousness just yet, the research is moving us steadily in that direction.
So to wrap things up, we've taken a pretty deep dive into the neuroscience of consciousness. We've talked about the challenges of studying something so subjective, how neuroscience defines and tries to measure it, the different theoretical frameworks trying to explain it, the fascinating world of unconscious vision, and the potential of neural manipulation to crack the code of our conscious experiences. It really shows how scientists are working like philosophers, using rigorous science to tackle these age-old questions about our inner lives.
Yes, and it's super important to remember that while we've made a lot of progress in identifying neural correlates of consciousness, there's still so much work to be done in establishing those causal explanatory links between brain activity and our subjective experiences. That's where the real breakthroughs will come from.
And as we sign off, here's something to ponder. If our conscious experiences are so closely tied to the activity of our neurons, what does that mean for how we understand reality itself, our sense of self, and maybe even our ability to understand and shape our own minds? It's a dynamic, constantly evolving field, full of unanswered questions and exciting possibilities, and your curiosity is a crucial part of this incredible journey of discovery.